At the inheritance meeting, my older sister slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany table and demanded I sign away all 20 of our late uncle's rental properties. She smiled, and my parents smiled right behind her, completely certain they had just erased me from the family legacy. Then the estate attorney opened the first deed from 2021 and showed them that every single page had my name on it. Her smile died right there. My name is Chloe Patterson. I am 32 years old and I work as a certified public accountant. Before I tell you exactly what happened in that stifling conference room and how I systematically dismantled my family's illusion of wealth, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with stories about setting hard boundaries. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. Now, let me take you straight into the room where my family thought they had me cornered. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in downtown Boston. The conference room at Sterling & Associates smelled of old leather and expensive coffee. I sat at one end of the massive oak table, feeling the chill of the air conditioning through my simple navy blazer. Across from me sat my 35-year-old sister, Savannah. Savannah was the golden child of the Patterson family. She wore a bright red designer dress that I knew for a fact cost more than her monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled and her posture screamed entitlement. Next to her sat her husband, Trent, wearing a custom-tailored suit and a heavy gold watch that he loved to flash whenever he adjusted his cuffs. Trent called himself a wealth manager, but as a CPA, I knew the absolute truth about his chaotic finances. Directly behind them, sitting in plush chairs like royalty holding court, were my parents, Robert and Linda. Savannah did not even wait for the estate attorney, David Sterling, to finish organizing his files. She reached into her oversized designer tote bag, pulled out a stack of legal documents, and shoved them across the smooth wood of the table. The papers stopped right in front of my hands. "Sign it, Chloe," she said. Her voice was sharp and laced with that familiar tone of absolute authority she had used on me since we were children. I looked down at the paper. It was a formal waiver, a complete relinquishment of any right to challenge the estate. "What exactly is this?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Savannah sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes at Trent as if dealing with me was a burden she barely had the strength to endure. "It is a simple release form," she said. "Uncle Thomas left 20 rental properties down in Florida. We all know he was sick and confused at the end of his life, but the family legacy needs to be protected now. Trent's investment firm needs a significant capital injection to close a massive commercial deal next quarter. Those 20 properties are going to provide that capital. I am taking over the portfolio, and Trent is going to liquidate them to secure our future." Trent leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and steepling his fingers together. "Look, Chloe," he said, using that condescending corporate voice he reserved for people he deemed beneath him. "Managing real estate is incredibly complex. It requires leverage strategy and aggressive market positioning. You are just a desk accountant. You crunch numbers for a living. You would not know the first thing about maximizing a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. If we leave those houses in the estate trust or try to divide them, they will just depreciate. Savannah and I have the infrastructure to turn those rundown rentals into a premium asset class. Just sign the waiver so we can bypass probate and get the deeds transferred into my holding company today. You do not need to worry your head about the legalities." I slowly looked past Trent and Savannah to where my parents were sitting. I waited for them to say something to defend me, or at least question why my sister was blatantly trying to seize the entirety of our late uncle's estate before the lawyer had even spoken a single word. Instead, my father Robert gave a firm nod. "Trent is right, Chloe," my father said. His voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "This is business. Your sister and her husband are building something real. They operate at a high level. You have a safe little accounting job. You do not need the stress of dealing with Florida real estate. You should be glad they are willing to take this burden off your shoulders." My mother Linda leaned forward, her face arranged in that patronizing mask of maternal concern that she always used when she was about to demand a sacrifice from me. "Just sign it, Chloe," she chimed in. Her voice was sickeningly sweet. "Do not be selfish today. We are supposed to be mourning your Uncle Thomas. Do not make this difficult and ruin the peace of this family. Your sister actually has a vision for this family's legacy. She and Trent are going to take us to the next level. You have always been so rigid and small-minded about money. Just do this one thing for your family and let your sister take the lead. It is what Thomas would have wanted." I sat there in the profound silence that followed, staring at the waiver. I felt the smooth paper under my fingertips. I thought about the sheer audacity of what they were attempting. They had walked into a legal proceeding fully intending to bully me into giving up my rights to a dead man's estate simply because they believed they deserved it more. They looked at me and saw nothing but a workhorse, a convenient stepping stone, a quiet girl who would always fold under pressure. For 32 years, I had been the invisible child in the Patterson household. I was the one who balanced their checkbooks, filed their taxes, and bailed them out when they overspent on luxury cars and country club memberships. Savannah got the praise, the glory, and the financial backing. I got the demands and the expectations. They were so confident in my obedience that they did not even consider the possibility that I might say no. They were practically vibrating with greed, imagining the millions of dollars they were about to liquidate to feed Trent's failing business. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply moved my hand away from the waiver and looked at the head of the table. David Sterling, the estate attorney, had been watching this entire exchange with a look of profound professional detachment. He was a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a demeanor that commanded absolute respect. I gave him a single brief nod. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. The sound cut through the heavy air of the conference room like a gunshot. He reached out and pushed Savannah's waiver far to the side of the table, dismissing it completely. Then he opened his thick leather binder and looked directly at my sister. "I am afraid you are profoundly mistaken, Savannah," he said. His voice was calm, measured, and utterly devastating. The room froze. Savannah's triumphant smile faltered. Trent dropped his hands flat onto the table. "What do you mean?" Trent demanded. "Thomas owned 20 single-family homes in Florida. We pulled the county records last year. The properties belong to the estate, and as his primary next of kin, the estate flows to Robert and then to us." Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses. "You pulled outdated records," he stated smoothly. "Those 20 properties are not part of Thomas Patterson's estate. They are not subject to probate. They are not available for you to transfer, liquidate, or leverage for your investment firm." My father stood up from his chair, his face flushing red. "That is impossible," my father shouted. "My brother owned those houses until the day he died. Who else would own them?" Mr. Sterling slowly turned a crisp white document around and slid it across the table toward my family. "I suggest you read the deed, Mr. Patterson. Those 20 properties were legally sold and transferred in October of 2021. They belong entirely to a private holding company, and the sole exclusive managing member of that company is sitting right across from you." He gestured toward me. "Chloe Patterson has been the legal and exclusive owner of that entire real estate portfolio for the past 3 years." The silence in that room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Savannah stared at the legal document, her eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing like she could not remember how to breathe. The smug, arrogant smile she had worn since she walked into the room completely died right there on her face. Trent grabbed the paper, yanking it toward him, his eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon, searching for a loophole that did not exist. My mother sank back into her plush chair, her hand flying to her chest in absolute shock. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, meeting their horrified stares with absolute calm. They had come here to strip me of an inheritance they believed I did not deserve. They had no idea they were sitting in the presence of the landlord. Savannah sat completely frozen in her plush leather chair. The breath had been violently knocked out of her lungs. I watched her perfectly manicured hands begin to tremble against the polished oak table. She looked down at the official Florida property deeds that David Sterling had just laid out in front of her. She looked back up at me. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. Beside her, Trent was aggressively shuffling through the heavy stack of papers. His expensive gold watch clanked loudly against the wood. His face was losing its artificial tan by the second, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He flipped to the second page and then the third. He was desperately searching for a mistake. He was looking for a forged signature, a typo or a legal loophole that would somehow give him control over the 20 houses he had already promised to his aggressive creditors. My parents, Robert and Linda, were practically paralyzed directly behind my sister. Just moments ago, they were smiling and nodding with absolute pride. They had been completely ready to watch their favorite daughter strip me of the only legacy my uncle had left behind. Now they stared at the thick stack of warranty deeds with utter horror. I did not move an inch. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, smoothing the fabric of my simple navy blazer. I watched the terrible realization wash over their faces. This was the moment I had waited 3 long years to see. In the Patterson house, love was never freely given. Love was a highly calculated transaction. Love was entirely based on appearances, social status, and what you could provide to enhance the family image. If you looked good and made the family look wealthy, you were rewarded with affection. If you were quiet and practical, you were nothing but a convenient tool to be used. Savannah had always been the undisputed golden child. From the time we were little girls, my mother paraded Savannah through endless beauty pageants and social events. My parents spent tens of thousands of dollars on custom gowns, professional vocal coaches, and expensive entry fees. Savannah was their beautiful investment. She was the star of the family who was destined to marry a wealthy man and elevate the Patterson name in the local country club scene. I was the exact opposite of everything they valued. I was the quiet one with dark hair who preferred math puzzles to makeup tutorials. My parents never saw any real value in my practicality until they realized they could exploit it. I became a certified public accountant because I desperately wanted financial stability. I wanted to build a secure life where I never had to rely on my parents for anything. But the moment I passed my rigorous licensing exams, my family decided my career was simply a free administrative service designed for their personal benefit. I looked across the table at Trent. He was heavily sweating now. Tiny beads of moisture were forming on his forehead, and his breathing was growing shallow. Trent was a smooth-talking wealth manager. He wore custom-tailored suits and drove leased European sports cars to project a flawless image of massive success. Savannah married him because he looked the absolute part of a young self-made millionaire. My parents adored him because he bought them expensive dinners at downtown steakhouses and promised them exclusive insider investment tips. But as a professional CPA, I knew the very ugly truth about my brother-in-law. Trent was completely drowning in debt. His firm was nothing but a fragile house of cards built on highly leveraged loans, desperate credit extensions, and empty promises to angry investors. For the past 4 years, my parents had aggressively forced me to do all of the complex corporate taxes for Trent's business. They called it my fundamental family duty. They told me that since Savannah and Trent were busy building an empire, the absolute least I could do was handle the boring paperwork. Every single tax season, I would spend countless unpaid hours late into the night, untangling Trent's incredibly messy financial records. I saw the massive credit card balances. I saw the desperate high-interest loans he took out to pay for Savannah's luxury vacations and designer wardrobes. When I tried to sit my parents down and warn them that Trent was functionally bankrupt, they completely ignored my professional warnings. My mother told me I was just deeply jealous of my sister's fabulous life. She actually said I was a bitter spinster who could not stand to see Savannah happy and successful. So I completely stopped warning them. I kept doing the taxes in silence because it gave me a front row seat to their impending financial ruin. I knew exactly how desperate Trent was for a massive injection of capital. That was exactly why he had marched into this law office today, expecting to easily steal 20 Florida rental properties. He desperately needed that equity to save himself from federal bankruptcy and aggressive creditors. He thought I would just hand over the keys because I had always handed over everything else. The financial exploitation did not stop with Trent's corporate taxes. My parents, Robert and Linda, lived far beyond their means to keep up false appearances with their wealthy friends. They maintained a massive suburban house with a perfectly manicured lawn and 2 expensive leased cars in the driveway. But behind closed doors, they were constantly panicking about their shrinking cash flow. 2 years ago, they sat me down and told me they were struggling to pay their soaring property taxes. They looked at me with those cold, demanding eyes and told me it was my responsibility to step up. They said they had provided food and shelter for me my whole life, and now it was time for me to pay them back. I ended up draining my own modest salary to pay their property tax bills while they continued to fund Savannah's lavish lifestyle. I was the invisible workhorse. I existed solely to maintain their grand illusion of wealth and superiority. I let out a slow, steady breath as I sat in the silent conference room. All those years of being dismissed, belittled, and used were finally culminating right here at this mahogany table. Savannah finally found her voice. It was shrill, panicked, and completely devoid of her usual arrogance. "This is a massive mistake," Savannah practically shrieked. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at David Sterling. "You printed the wrong documents. Uncle Thomas owned these properties. He told my father he owned these properties. There is absolutely no way my little sister bought a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. She is just a desk accountant. She crunches numbers in a cubicle. She barely makes enough to pay the mortgage on her tiny little condo." Trent slammed both of his hands down onto the table. The sound echoed sharply in the room. He leaned aggressively toward the attorney, his face twisted in desperate anger. "You need to check these county records again," Trent demanded with a furious edge to his voice. "We ran a comprehensive background check on Thomas Patterson last year. The properties were firmly in his name. If Chloe managed to get her name on these deeds, she must have committed some kind of massive legal fraud. She manipulated a sick old man into signing over his valuable assets. We are going to sue her. We are going to contest this entire transaction in court and have her CPA license permanently revoked." I did not flinch. I let Trent yell. I let him threaten me with lawsuits and professional ruin. The more he panicked, the more incredibly pathetic he looked. David Sterling did not even blink at the outburst. He calmly adjusted his glasses and looked at Trent with absolute professional disdain. "The documents are fully authenticated," Mr. Sterling stated calmly. "The transactions were recorded perfectly in the state of Florida in October of 2021. Comprehensive title insurance was issued. The deeds were signed, notarized, and filed legally with the county clerk. There is absolutely no fraud here. Chloe Patterson purchased the properties through a legitimate limited liability company. The records you pulled last year were likely incomplete, or you simply failed to search the LLC ownership structure properly." My father, Robert, suddenly stood up. His heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. His face was a dark mask of pure rage. He could not accept that his obedient, invisible daughter had outsmarted his golden child and his supposedly brilliant son-in-law. He walked around the edge of the table and stopped just a few feet away from me. He looked down at me with his chest heaving. The sheer toxic entitlement radiating from him was suffocating. "Chloe," my father growled. His voice was thick with venom and disbelief. "What kind of sick game are you playing here today? You are going to look me in the eye and explain yourself right now. You are just a quiet bookkeeper. You do not have the money to buy 20 houses. You do not have the business sense to manage a real estate portfolio of that massive size. How dare you sit there and let your mother and sister look like fools? How did you get your hands on my brother's properties?" My mother, Linda, stood up right behind him. She clutched her expensive designer purse tightly to her chest as if she needed it for physical protection against the truth. "You stole from your own family," my mother hissed. Her voice was trembling with absolute self-righteous indignation. "Thomas was supposed to leave those houses to us. We were his only real family. Savannah and Trent need that money to build their future. You have completely ruined everything. You need to sign those properties over to your sister right this minute, or you are no longer a part of this family." I looked at my mother and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, profound clarity. I remembered the long years of deep neglect. I remembered every single birthday she forgot, and every holiday dinner where she openly praised Savannah's beauty while ignoring my presence entirely. I remembered the extravagant country club wedding they threw for Savannah, demanding I contribute my savings to pay for the floral arrangements. I remembered how they had treated Uncle Thomas when he actually needed them. They were demanding answers right now, but they had absolutely no idea what they were actually asking for. They had no idea about the pure hell Uncle Thomas went through or the massive sacrifices I made to save him. "You want to know how a quiet bookkeeper managed to buy 20 houses?" I said. My voice was calm and incredibly steady. It cut through their screaming perfectly. "You really want to know how I became the sole legal owner of Uncle Thomas's entire portfolio while you all sat completely clueless in Boston?" My father slammed his fist onto the table again. The heavy thud made Savannah physically jump in her seat. "Tell me right now," my father demanded loudly. "Tell me how you manipulated my sick, dying brother into giving you his entire life savings." I looked directly into my father's furious eyes. The tension in the room was absolute. The air felt so incredibly thick, it was genuinely hard to breathe. They were all staring at me, waiting for a tearful confession of guilt. They expected me to lower my head and apologize for stepping out of line and ruining their perfect financial plans. But the woman they were yelling at did not exist anymore. The scared little girl who desperately wanted their conditional love had died a long time ago. I was the landlord now, and it was time they learned exactly how that happened. "I did not manipulate anyone," I said clearly. "I saved him. I saved him when you completely turned your back on him." The harsh memory of that terrible week came rushing back to me. The desperate phone calls, the crushing medical bills, the sheer cruelty of my parents when Uncle Thomas begged them for a simple lifeline. They wanted the truth. They were about to get the entire unvarnished reality of what actually happened in 2021. To understand exactly how we reached that explosive moment in the law office, you have to understand the terrible events of the year 2021. While my parents and my sister were busy parading their supposed wealth around their exclusive social circles in Boston, my Uncle Thomas was living a completely different reality down in Florida. Thomas was my father's older brother, but the two men could not have been more fundamentally different. My father, Robert, spent his entire life chasing corporate titles, luxury cars, and country club memberships. He cared absolutely only about the veneer of success and what other people thought of him. Thomas, on the other hand, was a man with rough, calloused hands and a quiet, practical dignity. He wore faded denim shirts and drove a beat-up pickup truck. He never cared about impressing anyone at a dinner party. Instead, he spent 30 long, grueling years slowly and painstakingly building a modest real estate portfolio from the ground up. He owned 20 single-family rental homes in working-class Florida neighborhoods. They were not glamorous beachfront mansions or luxury condos. They were simple, practical houses for plumbers, teachers, factory workers, and nurses. Thomas prided himself on providing decent, clean, and affordable housing for families who actually needed it. He knew every single one of his tenants by their first names. He fixed their leaky faucets and broken water heaters himself to save money. He brought them small gifts during the holidays. He was a genuinely good man who believed in hard, honest work and the value of treating people with basic human respect. Then, the global pandemic hit, and the entire world simply stopped. For massive corporate landlords with millions of dollars in liquid cash, the economic shutdown was a minor, frustrating inconvenience. But for independent mom and pop landlords like Uncle Thomas, it was an absolute financial catastrophe. When the federal and state governments suddenly rolled out the mandatory eviction moratoriums, they completely wiped out his entire source of income almost overnight. Many of his working-class tenants lost their service jobs and could no longer afford to pay their monthly rent. Because Thomas was a deeply compassionate and empathetic man, he absolutely refused to harass them. He told his tenants to feed their children first, to buy their groceries, and to worry about the rent whenever the world finally went back to normal. He genuinely believed that if he did the morally right thing, the universe would eventually balance itself out. But the massive commercial banks did not share his compassion. The banks did not care about a global health crisis or the terrible struggles of working-class families. They only cared about their automated monthly mortgage payments. While Thomas was legally forbidden from collecting rent or replacing his non-paying tenants, his property taxes, insurance premiums, and commercial mortgage bills continued to pile up with terrifying speed. Within just a few short months, his substantial cash reserves, the money he had saved for decades, were completely drained. He was burning through his savings just to keep the properties afloat while zero revenue came in the door. The financial bleeding was aggressive and relentless, but Thomas was a fighter. He spent his days on hold with aggressive loan officers, begging for forbearance programs. He spent his nights sitting alone at his kitchen table under a flickering light bulb, aggressively crunching numbers on a legal pad, trying to find a mathematical miracle that simply did not exist. He was absolutely determined to save the 20 houses he had spent 3 decades acquiring. But then, the universe delivered a second, completely devastating blow. Right in the middle of his desperate, frantic battle with the commercial banks, Thomas started feeling inexplicably tired. He ignored the sharp, stabbing pains in his stomach because he simply did not have the time or the money to visit a doctor. He convinced himself it was just the massive stress of the impending foreclosures. When the pain finally became so excruciating that he physically collapsed in the driveway of one of his rental properties, a terrified neighbor called an ambulance to take him to the emergency room. The medical diagnosis was swift and utterly brutal. He had early-stage colon cancer. In the American medical system, a serious illness is not just a terrifying health crisis. It is an absolute financial death sentence. Suddenly, Thomas was not just fighting to save his properties from aggressive bank foreclosure. He was fighting to literally save his own life. The rapidly mounting costs of aggressive chemotherapy, endless scans, specialized medications, and endless specialist appointments quickly consumed whatever tiny fraction of personal credit he had left. He maxed out his credit cards to pay for his medical treatments. He was completely financially trapped, with the walls closing in on him from every single direction. By October of 2021, the commercial banks had officially initiated foreclosure proceedings on all 20 of his Florida properties. The thick legal notices were arriving daily, demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars in immediate payment, or they would seize his entire life's work. Desperate, terrified, and physically weakened by his early intense rounds of chemotherapy, Uncle Thomas did the only thing he could possibly think of. He swallowed his immense personal pride, booked a cheap economy flight, and traveled straight to my parents' massive house in Boston. He came to beg his own flesh and blood for a temporary financial bridge loan to save his legacy. I was visiting my parents that evening, forced into my usual role of cooking their elaborate Sunday dinner. My mother, Linda, had insisted on preparing a massive prime rib roast because Savannah and her new boyfriend, Trent, were coming over for a formal family dinner. The massive mahogany dining room table was set with fine china, heavy silverware, and expensive crystal wine glasses. The entire house smelled of roasted garlic, fresh rosemary, and rich, expensive red wine. We were just sitting down to eat, preparing to listen to Trent brag about his supposed investment victories when the heavy brass doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on my apron and went to open the door. When I pulled it open, my breath completely hitched in my throat. Uncle Thomas stood on the grand front porch, looking like a fragile, faded shadow of the strong, vibrant man I remembered from my childhood. He had lost at least 30 pounds. His clothes hung loosely on his frail frame, and his skin had a grayish, sickly pallor that screamed of serious illness. He was clutching a thick, worn-out manila folder tightly to his chest, as if it contained his very soul. When I pulled him inside and hugged him, I could feel the sharp, rigid angles of his bones through his thin jacket. I immediately brought him into the formal dining room. The moment he stepped into the warm glow of the chandelier, the entire atmosphere in the room violently shifted. My father, Robert, looked up from carving the expensive prime rib, and his face immediately hardened into a dark mask of pure irritation. My mother visibly recoiled, pulling her crisp linen napkin onto her lap, and leaning back as if Thomas carried some kind of contagious disease that might infect her perfect dining room. Savannah and Trent just stared at him with blatant, undisguised judgment, looking him up and down with absolute disgust. Nobody offered him a chair to sit down. Nobody asked if he was hungry or thirsty. Nobody even bothered to ask how he was feeling, despite his obviously deteriorating physical condition. Thomas stood at the end of the long mahogany table, swaying slightly on his feet, but clutching his folder with determination. He did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. He knew he was intruding, but his desperation overrode his manners. His voice was shaking slightly as he laid out his entire devastating situation. He explained the harsh reality of the eviction moratoriums, the aggressive bank foreclosures, and the crushing, terrifying weight of his cancer diagnosis. He opened the worn manila folder and placed his detailed financial spreadsheets right next to my father's dinner plate. He showed them exactly how much massive equity was still trapped in those 20 houses. He proved mathematically that the portfolio was inherently valuable and simply suffering from a temporary, devastating cash flow crisis caused by a global emergency. "Robert," Thomas pleaded. His voice was thick with a kind of raw emotional vulnerability that completely shattered my heart. "I am not asking for a permanent handout. I am asking for a short-term commercial bridge loan. Just enough liquid capital to satisfy the banks and cover my basic medical treatments until the rental market finally stabilizes. I will pay you back with aggressive above-market interest. I will sign a binding legal promissory note. I will give you a direct first-position lien on all 20 properties. Just please do not let the banks take everything I have built over the last 30 years. I am begging you as your brother. I am literally fighting for my life here." My father did not even glance down at the carefully prepared spreadsheets. He calmly set his heavy carving knife down, picked up his crystal wine glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive Cabernet. He looked at his older brother with eyes that were completely devoid of basic human empathy. It was the cold, calculating gaze of a man who measured human worth strictly by bank account balances and social status. "Thomas," my father said in a smooth, sickeningly patronizing tone, "you have always been incredibly reckless with your business decisions. You bought cheap, ugly houses in working-class neighborhoods and rented them to people who live paycheck to paycheck. You took on a massive amount of unnecessary risk, and now you are facing the harsh financial consequences of your own poor judgment. I am deeply sorry to hear about your health issues, but I absolutely cannot mix family with bad business. Linda and I have a very specific lifestyle to maintain. We have a certain standard of living that requires careful capital management. I'm not going to drain my liquid assets to bail you out of a sinking ship. The risk profile is simply too high. You need to formally declare bankruptcy and let the commercial banks take the houses. It is the only practical financial solution for someone in your position." I felt my stomach physically drop to the floor. My father was casually telling his sick, desperate brother to give up everything he had ever worked for, just so he would not have to risk a tiny fraction of his own hoarded wealth. But before Thomas could even respond to the cruel, devastating rejection, my sister Savannah leaned back in her plush chair. She swirled her expensive wine lazily and looked at Thomas with an expression of sheer, absolute disgust. She wanted to impress Trent by showing exactly how ruthless and elite the Patterson family truly was. She wanted to prove she belonged to a class of people who did not tolerate failure. "Honestly, Uncle Thomas," Savannah said. Her voice was loud and piercing, cutting through the heavy, terrible silence of the dining room. "You have always been a massive financial liability to this family. You walk in here looking like a literal homeless person, interrupting our formal dinner and demanding our money just because you failed at real estate. We are busy building a real, wealthy legacy here. Trent and I have serious corporate investments to focus on. Let the banks take your junk houses. We absolutely cannot let you drag our pristine credit scores down with your ridiculous sob story." My mother nodded enthusiastically in total agreement with Savannah's vile statement. "Your sister is entirely right," my mother added, looking directly at me as if daring me to speak up and defend him. "We simply cannot afford to have the Patterson name associated with a massive multi-property foreclosure. People in our country club circle talk. It would completely ruin our social reputation. You need to leave, Thomas. We are eating dinner, and you are ruining the evening." Uncle Thomas stood there for a long, terrible moment, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their cruelty. He looked at his brother, who was already reaching for the carving knife again. He looked at his sister-in-law, who was adjusting her diamond earrings. He looked at the niece, who had just called him a worthless liability, to his face. I saw the very last tiny flicker of hope completely die in his tired, sunken eyes. He slowly reached down, closed his manila folder, and picked it up off the table. His frail hands were trembling so badly he could barely grip the paper. He did not yell. He did not curse at them. He simply turned around with quiet, broken dignity and walked out of the formal dining room. The sound of the heavy oak front door clicking shut echoed through the house like a final, devastating verdict. I stood completely frozen in the kitchen doorway, watching my family immediately return to their expensive meal. My father sliced into the prime rib as if he had simply swatted away an annoying insect. Savannah and Trent laughed about a recent country club golf tournament, completely unfazed by the fact that they had just condemned a sick family member to total financial ruin and possibly death. They had brutally abandoned him when he needed them the absolute most. They looked at a dying, desperate man and saw nothing but an inconvenience to their perfectly curated, wealthy aesthetic. That was the exact moment something inside my mind fundamentally and permanently broke. I watched them chewing their food and drinking their wine, and I realized they were entirely morally bankrupt. They possessed absolutely no loyalty, no compassion, and no love for anyone who could not actively elevate their social standing or feed their massive egos. I knew right then and there that I could never let them get away with this absolute betrayal. I quietly untied my cooking apron, folded it over a wooden kitchen chair, and walked straight out the back door into the cold Boston night. I had to find my Uncle Thomas before he reached the airport. I had to save his legacy because I finally understood that my biological family would gladly watch him burn to the ground if it meant keeping their own hands clean. I did not even pack a proper suitcase when I left my parents' house that terrible night. I drove straight to Logan International Airport the very next morning. I bought a direct ticket to Orlando, Florida, using a credit card I kept hidden for extreme emergencies. I did not tell my parents where I was going. I did not tell my sister Savannah. I simply sent a brief email to my accounting firm, requesting a week of personal leave, and I boarded the plane. I knew with absolute certainty that I had to act immediately before the commercial banks completely devoured my uncle's life. When I landed, the heavy Florida humidity hit me the second I stepped out of the terminal, but I barely noticed the heat. I rented a cheap compact car and drove straight to the working-class neighborhood where Uncle Thomas lived. He resided in a modest single-story ranch house that was virtually identical to the 20 rental properties he had spent his entire adult life acquiring. When he opened the front door, he looked completely exhausted. The harsh afternoon sun illuminated the deep hollows of his cheeks and the sickly gray undertone of his skin caused by the aggressive chemotherapy. He was absolutely shocked to see me standing on his porch holding my laptop bag. I did not waste time with small talk or emotional pleasantries. I walked right past him into his small living room, and what I saw completely broke my heart. Every single flat surface in the room was covered in terrifying legal paperwork. The coffee table, the dining chairs, the kitchen counters. Everything was buried under a massive mountain of final notices, foreclosure warnings, and aggressive letters from debt collectors. It was the physical manifestation of a good man slowly drowning in a broken system. I am a certified public accountant. I do not panic when I look at a financial disaster. I conquer it. I told Uncle Thomas to go to his bedroom and rest. I brewed a massive pot of cheap black coffee, cleared a wide space on his worn kitchen table, and went straight to work. For 3 consecutive days and nights, I barely slept. I ripped through his chaotic filing cabinets and overflowing shoeboxes. I organized years of messy tenant ledgers, complicated tax assessments, and intimidating commercial mortgage statements. I built a comprehensive financial model on my laptop, detailing exactly how much liquid cash was required to pull his entire portfolio out of the danger zone. The situation was incredibly grim, but it was not impossible. The properties themselves were incredibly valuable assets, located in strong working-class neighborhoods with high rental demand. They were simply suffering from a severe but temporary cash flow crisis caused by the sudden government eviction moratoriums. The banks only cared about the immediate past due balances. If those massive arrears could be satisfied, the entire portfolio would survive the storm. The total amount of capital required to pay off the bank arrears, satisfy the mounting back taxes, and establish a safe 6-month operating reserve was staggering. It was far more money than any average 30-year-old possessed. But I was not an average 30-year-old. For 8 grueling years, I had worked relentless 60-hour weeks at a major accounting firm. While my sister Savannah spent her money on designer handbags, expensive brunches, and luxury vacations, I'd hoarded every single penny I earned. I lived in a tiny, cramped condo. I drove a 10-year-old car. I rarely ate at restaurants, and I bought my clothes at discount stores. I had sacrificed the entirety of my 20s to build an impenetrable fortress of financial security so I would never have to rely on my toxic parents for anything. I opened my laptop and looked at the balance in my primary savings account. That number represented my ultimate freedom. It represented 8 years of blood, sweat, and absolute isolation. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Then I logged into my banking portal and initiated a massive wire transfer. I completely drained my life savings down to the very last dollar. But my personal savings alone were not enough to satisfy the aggressive commercial lenders. I needed significantly more leverage to save all 20 houses. I spent an entire afternoon pacing in my uncle's backyard, talking on the phone with a private hard money lender I knew from my corporate real estate audits back in Boston. Hard money loans are absolutely brutal. They carry exorbitant interest rates and demand ruthless repayment terms, but they provide immediate liquid capital when traditional banks refuse to even look at you. I used my own flawless credit score and my professional credentials as a CPA to secure the remaining funds. I put my own financial neck entirely on the line. If this portfolio failed, I would be personally bankrupt. I would lose everything I had ever worked for. But as I walked back inside and looked at Uncle Thomas sleeping fitfully on his worn-out sofa, listening to his labored breathing, I knew I was making the only right choice. He was the only person in the Patterson family who had ever treated me like a human being. On the 4th morning, I walked into the kitchen and slid a certified cashier's check across the table. Uncle Thomas stared at the piece of paper. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he read the massive numbers printed across the front. He looked up at me with tears pooling in the corners of his eyes. He slowly shook his head and pushed the check back toward me. He told me his pride would never allow him to take his niece's entire life savings. He was a hardworking man who had never taken a handout in his entire life. He told me he would rather let the commercial banks foreclose on his legacy than financially ruin me. I pushed the check right back to him. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with the firm, unyielding authority of a seasoned financial controller. I told him this was absolutely not a charity handout. I told him it was a strategic corporate acquisition. I explained exactly how we were going to fix his life. We were going to go to a local Florida real estate attorney that very afternoon. We were going to establish a brand new limited liability company. I would be the sole exclusive managing member of that LLC. Uncle Thomas would execute a legally binding warranty deed transferring full and absolute ownership of all 20 rental properties into my company. In exchange, my LLC would formally assume all the existing commercial mortgages, pay off the massive tax arrears, and guarantee him a generous monthly medical stipend for the rest of his natural life. He would never have to worry about a hospital bill, a bank notice, or an eviction threat ever again. We sat in the quiet, air-conditioned office of a prominent real estate attorney in Orlando. The lawyer meticulously drafted the heavy stack of transfer documents. Uncle Thomas read every single page with quiet dignity. His frail hands shook as he picked up the heavy black pen. I watched him sign his name over and over again, legally relinquishing the empire he had spent 30 years building. But he was not sad, as the notary loudly stamped the final warranty deed. Uncle Thomas looked at me with an expression of profound peace. He knew his legacy was entirely safe. He knew the working-class families in those 20 houses would not be thrown out onto the street by some ruthless, faceless corporate hedge fund. He trusted me completely. From that precise legal moment in October 2021, I became the sole legitimate owner of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. I flew back to Boston the following week and immediately resumed my normal, quiet life. Nobody in my family asked where I had been. Nobody even noticed I was missing. I went straight back to my drab cubicle at the accounting firm and slipped right back into my familiar role as the invisible, reliable workhorse. But my reality had fundamentally shifted. During my short lunch breaks, I made aggressive phone calls to property managers down in Florida. Late at night, sitting completely alone in my cramped condo, I aggressively renegotiated vendor contracts, reviewed massive stacks of tenant applications, and structured realistic payment plans for the families who were struggling to catch up on their rent. Within 8 months, the government eviction moratoriums finally lifted and the local rental market completely exploded. I raised rents fairly as units naturally turned over. I refinanced the brutal hard money loan into a traditional low-interest commercial mortgage using the newly stabilized cash flow. The terrifying red numbers on my massive spreadsheets slowly turned black, and then they turned a beautiful, vibrant green. The portfolio began generating a shocking amount of monthly revenue. I used the initial profits to completely renovate the older units, increasing their overall market value substantially. More importantly, I paid for Uncle Thomas to receive the absolute best experimental cancer treatments available, extending his life by 2 full years in relative comfort. The dying real estate portfolio completely transformed into an incredibly highly profitable machine. I was privately managing an asset class that rivaled the portfolios of the wealthy corporate clients I audited at my day job, yet absolutely nothing changed about how the Patterson family treated me. I would spend my Friday nights authorizing $50,000 roof replacements for my Florida properties, and then I would drive to my parents' massive suburban house on Sunday for family dinner. I would sit at their mahogany dining table wearing a cheap sweater from a discount store. I would quietly eat my food while my father Robert complained loudly about his high property taxes. I would listen to my mother Linda brag to her wealthy country club friends on the phone about Savannah's fabulous, glamorous life. Savannah would sit directly across from me drinking expensive champagne, paid for by high-interest credit cards, complaining about how exhausted she was from planning her extravagant wedding. Trent would wear his flashy gold watch and condescendingly explain basic financial concepts to me as if I was a complete idiot who could not understand simple math. They treated me exactly like a glorified secretary. After dinner, my father would snap his fingers and order me to clear the heavy china plates from the table. My mother would hand me a thick stack of Trent's chaotic corporate tax receipts and demand that I sort them out before Monday morning. Savannah would toss me her dry cleaning tickets and ask me to run her personal errands because my schedule was supposedly so flexible and unimportant. They ruthlessly mocked my modest apartment. They pitied my quiet single life. They completely convinced themselves that I was a tragic, boring failure who was incredibly lucky to even be allowed in their presence. I never said a single word in my defense. I never defended my career choices. I never once mentioned the massive real estate wire transfers I authorized every single week. I just smiled politely, cleared their dirty plates, and took their messy tax receipts. The psychological power of holding a massive secret is incredibly intoxicating. While my family desperately sought endless external validation through leased luxury cars and fake social media posts, I found absolute unshakable peace in my secret spreadsheets. I did not need to wear a designer dress to know my exact net worth. I did not need to brag at a country club to know I had successfully saved a dying man's legacy. I let them call me a quiet bookkeeper. I let them think they were superior, because I knew that underneath their glossy, perfectly curated, wealthy facade, they were completely morally and financially bankrupt. I was quietly, silently building an unbreakable fortress, while they were aggressively dancing on a fragile house of cards. I knew the absolute truth, and I was perfectly willing to wait in the shadows until the exact right moment to burn their grand illusion entirely to the ground. In the spring of 2022, the grand illusion of the Patterson family reached its absolute dizzying peak. Savannah and Trent formally announced their engagement, and my parents immediately went into a frantic performance mode. A modest, beautiful wedding was absolutely out of the question for their golden child. Savannah demanded a lavish $150,000 spectacle at the most exclusive historic country club in our state. She wanted imported white orchids cascading from the ceilings, a 12-piece live band playing classical music, and a custom designer bridal gown that cost more than my entire first year of college tuition. My father, Robert, and my mother, Linda, did not have that kind of liquid cash simply lying around. They were already stretched incredibly thin, just paying the massive property taxes and heavy maintenance costs on their large suburban home. But admitting they could not easily afford a luxury wedding meant admitting they were not the ultra-wealthy elite they desperately pretended to be to their country club friends. So they made the absolute most reckless financial decision of their entire lives. They quietly and completely emptied their retirement accounts. Every single dollar they had saved for their old age was violently liquidated to pay for Savannah's perfect day. I watched it happen in absolute, complete disbelief. Because I was heavily pressured into handling their tax filings, I saw the massive early withdrawal penalties they incurred. I tried to warn them. I sat in their kitchen and explained the brutal, unyielding math, showing them exactly how this would completely decimate their long-term financial future. My mother just waved her manicured hand and told me I lacked fundamental vision. She said Savannah's wedding was a crucial social investment. Trent was a prestigious wealth manager, she claimed, and his wealthy clients needed to see that he married into a prominent, successful family. My role in this grand production was exactly what you would expect. I was not asked to be a bridesmaid. Savannah said my practical, sensible aesthetic did not match her glamorous, high-fashion bridal party vision. Instead, I was forcefully assigned to be the unpaid background wedding coordinator. I managed the frantic catering vendors. I directed the parking attendants in the rain. I stood in the shadows of the grand ballroom, wearing a plain beige dress holding a rigid clipboard, while my parents proudly toasted their golden daughter and their supposedly brilliant new son-in-law. They drank wildly expensive champagne paid for by their liquidated retirement funds, completely oblivious to the steep financial cliff they were actively sprinting toward. The glamorous, luxurious honeymoon phase did not last very long. Shortly after Savannah and Trent returned from their expensive 3-week trip to the Maldives, the grim, terrifying reality of Trent's business began to severely crack their perfect, glossy facade. Trent was not a brilliant financial mind. He was a high-risk, desperate gambler, playing with heavily leveraged, borrowed money. When the commercial market experienced a sudden, sharp downturn, his aggressive, highly speculative investments started tanking with terrifying speed. Because my parents still aggressively guilted me into acting as Trent's unpaid corporate accountant under the guise of supporting the family, I saw the horrific financial bleeding firsthand. I stared at his massive, complicated spreadsheets, late at night, completely horrified by the sheer volume of his toxic debt. He had taken out aggressive, high-interest, hard money loans just to cover immediate margin calls. His cash flow was completely and dangerously negative. His supposedly elite firm was nothing but a fragile, empty shell, waiting to totally collapse under the crushing weight of its own leveraged obligations. I printed out the devastating balance sheets and brought them directly to my father. I laid the catastrophic red numbers out on his heavy mahogany desk. I told him clearly that Trent was functionally bankrupt and that his entire business model was fundamentally unsustainable and borderline fraudulent. My father refused to even look at the papers. He angrily shoved the detailed financial reports back across the desk and told me I simply did not understand high-level corporate finance. He said Trent was just experiencing a normal temporary market correction and that true wealthy entrepreneurs never panic during a slight downturn. But I knew my father was terrified. I could clearly see the raw, desperate panic hiding just behind his angry, dismissive eyes. He knew he had completely drained his life savings to marry his absolute favorite daughter to a man who was quietly drowning in massive toxic debt. And because my parents had completely emptied their retirement accounts for that ridiculous, extravagant country club wedding, they had absolutely no financial safety net left to bail Trent out. They were totally and completely out of cash. They had exhausted their home equity lines of credit. Their platinum credit cards were aggressively maxed out just from maintaining their wealthy suburban lifestyle. The heavy walls were rapidly closing in on the Patterson family illusion. They desperately needed a massive injection of liquid capital to save Trent from public default and to save Savannah from the deep, intense humiliation of a bankrupt husband. And since they had no money left of their own, they naturally turned their desperate, calculating eyes toward their invisible, reliable scapegoat. The inevitable breaking point arrived during Thanksgiving dinner in November of 2022. The atmosphere inside my parents' massive colonial home was incredibly thick with dark, unspoken tension. My mother had furiously insisted on hosting her usual extravagant holiday feast to keep up wealthy appearances for their snooping neighbors. The massive dining room table was heavily burdened with an absurd amount of expensive catered food that they put on credit. But the underlying mood in the house was deeply frantic and toxic. Savannah sat at the formal table looking physically exhausted and incredibly irritable. She aggressively complained to the room that Trent had abruptly canceled their planned winter ski trip to Aspen, citing mysterious business complications. Trent sat stiffly next to her, drinking heavily from a crystal glass of expensive scotch, constantly checking his buzzing phone every 2 minutes with a frantic, nervous energy. He snapped at Savannah when she asked him a simple question about his clients. My parents hovered around them, offering forced, overly bright smiles that completely failed to reach their deeply worried eyes. I spent the entire long afternoon trapped in the hot kitchen, cooking side dishes, carving the heavy turkey, and washing the delicate porcelain plates while they performed their fragile, wealthy pantomime in the dining room. I honestly did not mind the intense physical labor. The hot, busy kitchen was the only safe, quiet place in that house, where I did not have to listen to their delusional, arrogant bragging. I scrubbed pots and pans while they argued about luxury car leases in the next room. After the tense dinner finally concluded and the heavy dessert plates were cleared, my father abruptly walked into the kitchen. He quietly and firmly closed the heavy wooden door behind him, deliberately shutting out the noise from the living room. He stood squarely in front of the door, physically blocking my only exit, and looked at me with an expression of intense, desperate calculation. He did not ask how my long day was. He did not thank me for spending 8 hours cooking and cleaning up after his perfect holiday meal. He simply crossed his arms over his chest and delivered a demand so incredibly audacious and cruel that it literally took my breath away. He told me that Trent's wealth management business was facing a minor temporary cash flow issue. He lied smoothly to my face, claiming it was just a simple bureaucratic delay with a major overseas corporate client. But to secure his highly valuable corporate assets, Trent needed an immediate, massive liquid bridge loan. My father claimed that since his own capital was temporarily tied up in long-term conservative investments, another blatant, ridiculous lie, he needed me to step up and fulfill my fundamental family duty. He looked me dead in the eye without a single ounce of shame and demanded that I go to my bank on Monday morning and take out a maximum second mortgage on my personal condominium. He wanted me to pull every single ounce of equity out of my home and hand the entire lump sum directly over to Trent. I stood completely still by the sink, slowly wiping my wet hands on a dish towel. My condo was small and extremely modest, but it was the only thing I owned free and clear. I had worked grueling 60-hour weeks analyzing tax documents to aggressively pay down that specific mortgage early. It was my quiet sanctuary and my sole financial safety net in a highly unpredictable world. My father was casually asking me to risk my entire safe, secure life to blindly throw money into the dark, endless black hole of Trent's failing fraudulent business. I looked at my father and felt a deep, cold, absolute clarity wash over my entire body. I asked him a very simple question. I asked him exactly what would happen if Trent defaulted on the massive loan. I asked him who would pay my hefty mortgage when the bank inevitably came to take my home away. My father waved his hand dismissively, entirely annoyed by my practical, logical accounting questions. He said, "Real family does not ask those kinds of selfish, cynical questions." He told me that Savannah was my older sister, and that saving her marriage and preserving her social standing in the community was the absolute most important priority for everyone in the house. He actually had the sheer, unmitigated nerve to tell me that, because I was a single woman with a boring, quiet life, I did not need the deep financial security nearly as much as Savannah did. He said I was being incredibly selfish and petty for hesitating when my beautiful golden sister was in a moment of temporary distress. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, raising his voice to actively intimidate me, demanding that I show some actual loyalty to the Patterson name. The sheer toxic, blinding entitlement radiating from him was utterly suffocating. He fully and completely expected me to blindly sacrifice my entire hard-earned future just to buy his favorite daughter a few more desperate months of pretending to be rich. The kitchen felt incredibly small as my father stood between me and the door. He fully expected me to break under his intimidating posture. He expected me to lower my head, apologize for my hesitation, and immediately agree to mortgage my entire future to save his reckless son-in-law. But the woman standing in front of him was not the obedient scapegoat he thought he knew. I was a woman who had secretly saved our uncle's real estate empire from the brink of total collapse. I had handled millions of dollars in aggressive commercial transactions. I was not going to be bullied by a man who had drained his own retirement account just to impress his superficial country club friends. I wiped my hands on the dish towel one final time and set it down on the granite counter. I squared my shoulders and looked my father directly in his eyes. I did not blink. I did not step backward. I did not offer a single excuse or apology. "No," I said. It was a single, hard, unflinching word. It hung in the heavy air of the kitchen like a physical object. My father stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The complete lack of compliance in my voice genuinely shocked him. "What did you just say to me?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, aggressive whisper. I said no. I repeated, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "I am not taking out a second mortgage on my home. I am not draining my personal equity, and I am absolutely not handing over a single dollar of my hard-earned money to bail Trent out of a financial disaster that he created entirely by himself. My answer is no, and it will remain no." For a split second, my father was completely speechless. Then the pure toxic fury washed over his face. The veins in his neck visibly bulged, and his face turned a dark shade of crimson. He had spent his entire life controlling the narrative in our family, and my absolute defiance shattered his fragile illusion of authority. "How dare you!" he roared. His voice was so incredibly loud that it rattled the expensive crystal glasses sitting on the serving tray. "I am your father. I am telling you what this family needs, and you are going to do exactly as you are told." The sheer volume of his aggressive outburst completely shattered the quiet atmosphere of the formal dining room. Within seconds, the heavy wooden door of the kitchen swung open. My mother Linda rushed into the room with Savannah and Trent trailing closely behind her. The perfectly curated holiday aesthetic was instantly destroyed, replaced by raw, desperate panic. "Robert, what on earth is going on in here?" my mother demanded, clutching her expensive pearl necklace. "We can hear you yelling all the way in the living room." "Your ungrateful daughter is refusing to help her own family," my father spat, pointing a furious, trembling finger directly at my chest. "She is refusing to pull the equity from her condo to secure Trent's bridge loan. She is perfectly willing to sit back and watch her sister suffer just because she is too incredibly selfish to make a simple financial sacrifice." The dynamic in the kitchen instantly shifted. I was suddenly completely surrounded. The four of them formed a hostile, aggressive wall blocking my exit. Trent stood in the back, sweating profusely through his custom-tailored dress shirt. His eyes were wide and frantic like a cornered animal. He knew his fraudulent business was on the absolute brink of total collapse, and he needed my money to survive the week. Savannah stepped forward, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure venom. "You have got to be kidding me, Chloe," Savannah sneered. "We are talking about my future. We are talking about Trent's elite firm. You live in a tiny, boring little box, and you spend your entire life staring at spreadsheets. You do not even need that equity. Why are you being such a bitter, difficult person? Are you really that jealous of my life?" "I am not jealous, Savannah," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly detached and professional. "I am financially literate. Your husband is completely drowning in highly leveraged toxic debt. His firm is a fragile shell game, and I am not going to let him sink my secure life to buy you a few more months of pretending to be a wealthy socialite." Trent practically lunged forward, his face contorted in panic and rage. "You do not know what you are talking about," Trent shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You are just a low-level desk accountant. You do not understand high-level wealth management. This is a temporary market correction. I just need a small injection of liquid capital to cover my immediate margin calls. If you do not give me that money, my entire portfolio could be compromised." "Then it gets compromised," I said plainly. "That is not my problem." My mother let out a loud, dramatic gasp as if I had just physically struck her. She stepped directly in front of me, her eyes blazing with absolute toxic hatred. The polished maternal facade she wore for her country club friends completely melted away, revealing the deeply cruel woman underneath. "You are a vile, ungrateful, and intensely selfish child," my mother screamed. Spit practically flew from her lips. "After everything we have done for you, after we put a roof over your head and fed you for 18 years, this is how you repay us. You stand there and refuse to help your own sister in her time of need. You do not even deserve the Patterson name. You are a complete embarrassment to this family." "She is just a pathetic, jealous spinster," Savannah added, her voice dripping with sheer malice. "She has absolutely nobody to love her. She comes home to an empty apartment every single night. She cannot stand the fact that I am beautiful and happily married to a successful man. She wants to watch my marriage fail because she is utterly miserable in her own pathetic little life. They expected me to break. They fully anticipated that the intense psychological pressure, the vicious insults, and the aggressive gang-up would force me to collapse into tears. They thought I would drop to my knees, beg for their conditional forgiveness, and immediately offer to sign whatever bank documents they demanded just to restore the fragile peace of the family. But I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there and observed them. It was the most profound, liberating moment of my entire life. Looking at my parents and my sister, I did not see a powerful, wealthy family. I saw a group of desperate, terrified parasites. I saw a father who had foolishly liquidated his entire retirement to fund a fake aesthetic. I saw a mother whose entire self-worth was entirely dependent on what her superficial neighbors thought of her. I saw a sister who had married a fraudulent con artist and a brother-in-law who was moments away from a massive federal financial disaster. They were drowning in a deep, dark ocean of their own making, and they were furiously angry that I refused to throw myself into the water to serve as their life raft. The emotional manipulation simply did not work anymore. Their toxic words washed right over me, without leaving a single mark. I realized with absolute clarity that I held all the power in this room. They needed my money to survive, but I absolutely did not need them. I slowly reached over to the kitchen counter and untied the plain beige cooking apron I had been wearing for the past 8 hours. I folded it neatly and set it down next to the dirty roasting pan. I picked up my simple leather purse from the corner stool. "I think I am done cooking for tonight," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, carrying the quiet, absolute authority of a woman who had finally completely freed herself. "You can finish washing your own dishes. And Trent, I strongly suggest you find a very good bankruptcy attorney before the federal regulators audit your chaotic files. I officially resign as your unpaid accountant." I turned and walked straight through their hostile, aggressive wall. My father tried to step in my way, but I did not even break my stride. I walked right past him through the heavy wooden door across the massive formal living room and straight out the front door into the freezing cold November night. I got into my 10-year-old car, locked the doors, and drove away from their beautiful, toxic suburban mansion. I drove back to my modest, secure condo, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute peace. But the vicious fallout from my ultimate refusal was only just beginning. Over the next several weeks, my family completely lost their minds. They realized that their primary scapegoat had officially escaped the enclosure, and they launched a massive, aggressive campaign of sheer psychological warfare to drag me back into submission. Because Trent's financial situation was rapidly deteriorating from a severe crisis into an absolute catastrophe, they became increasingly frantic and completely unhinged. It started with the aggressive, manipulative voicemails. Trent would call my personal cell phone at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I never once answered the phone, but I woke up to long, rambling messages left on my machine. "Chloe, you really need to reconsider this," Trent's voice would echo through my silent apartment. Sometimes he tried to sound arrogant and demanding. "I have the loan documents completely drawn up. The interest rate on your condo is incredibly favorable right now. If you do not sign these papers by Friday, my firm is going to miss a massive commercial acquisition. You are directly hurting your sister's future. You are actively destroying this family. Call me back immediately and tell me when we are going to the bank." When the arrogant demands did not work, his voicemails would shift into a dark, panicked aggression. "You listen to me, you arrogant little bookkeeper!" Trent screamed into my voicemail a few days later. "You owe this family. You owe Savannah. I am completely tapped out on my commercial credit lines, and if I miss these margin calls, the regulators are going to start asking questions. Do you understand what you are doing? You need to wire me that equity right now, or I swear to God, I will make sure your professional accounting reputation is permanently destroyed in this city." I did not panic. I did not block his number. Instead, I operated with the cold, calculating precision of a seasoned financial auditor preparing for a massive federal trial. I bought a secure external hard drive and opened a heavily encrypted cloud storage folder. I meticulously saved every single aggressive voicemail Trent left me. I labeled them by date time and the specific nature of his threats. My parents were equally relentless, but their tactics were entirely based on toxic, emotional extortion. My mother, Linda, sent me dozens of massive paragraph-long text messages, perfectly highlighting her sheer, unadulterated entitlement. I cannot believe I raised such a deeply selfish and cruel daughter. One text message read, "Your sister has been crying herself to sleep every single night because Trent is so stressed about his business. You have the money sitting right there in your condo equity. It is just sitting there, doing absolutely nothing, while your family suffers. You are dead to me until you fix this." My father resorted to direct, heavy-handed financial threats. "If you do not sign that second mortgage for Trent by the end of the week, I am officially writing you completely out of my will." My father texted me on a Tuesday afternoon, "You will not receive a single dime of my estate. Savannah will inherit everything. You will be completely cut off from the Patterson legacy forever. Think very carefully about the massive mistake you are making, Chloe." I sat at my desk and looked at that specific text message. I almost laughed out loud at the sheer, rich irony of his aggressive threat. My father was threatening to cut me out of an estate that was already entirely, completely bankrupt. He had completely liquidated his retirement accounts for a wedding and was currently drowning in consumer debt to keep up his country club appearances. The only actual legacy he had to leave behind was a mountain of unpaid bills. But more importantly, I thought about the massive secret portfolio of 20 highly profitable Florida rental properties sitting safely and securely under my own limited liability company. I already owned the only valuable asset this family had ever produced, and I had purchased it with my own money. I did not reply to a single text message. I did not return a single phone call. I maintained absolute total silence. I simply took clear, high-resolution screenshots of every toxic text, every threat, and every manipulative demand. I uploaded them directly into my secure encrypted cloud folder, right next to Trent's panicked, unhinged audio recordings. I was patiently building an impenetrable fortress of hard, undeniable evidence. I watched their escalating panic from a safe distance, fully understanding exactly what it meant. Trent's business was sinking much faster than even I had originally calculated. The commercial lenders were completely closing in on him. My parents were completely out of options. The sheer desperation in their messages proved that their glossy, wealthy facade was absolutely crumbling into dust. They thought they were intimidating me. They thought their aggressive threats would eventually wear me down and force me back into my lifelong role as their quiet, submissive servant. They had absolutely no idea that every single threatening voicemail and toxic text message was simply adding more heavy ammunition to the massive, explosive arsenal I was preparing to drop on them. I was not just sitting back and taking their abuse. I was actively, deliberately letting them build their own perfect trap. The storm was rapidly approaching. The final devastating confrontation was absolutely inevitable. I just kept saving the files, backing up the data, and quietly waiting for the day they finally tried to come for the Florida properties. Because when that day arrived, I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to burn their entire delusional world straight to the ground. Let them scream. Let them threaten. The invisible scapegoat was finally ready for war. Fast forward to just a few months ago. The highly experimental cancer treatments that we had aggressively funded using the massive profits from the rental properties had given Uncle Thomas 2 incredibly beautiful extra years of life. Those were 2 years of quiet, peaceful conversations, sitting on the screened back porch of his modest Florida home, watching the heavy summer rainstorms wash over the neighborhood. We spent those months transitioning the massive real estate portfolio completely under my direct control. I learned every single intricate detail about commercial property management tenant relations and strategic asset leveraging directly from the man who had built it all from scratch. It was a masterclass in honest business, and we formed a bond that was thicker and more profound than any biological connection I shared with my actual parents. But the human body can only endure so much punishment. The aggressive colon cancer eventually returned with a vicious, absolute vengeance, spreading through his system with terrifying speed. By the time the exhausted doctors finally moved him into a specialized end-of-life hospice facility in Orlando, I knew with absolute certainty that we were nearing the end of our journey together. I immediately arranged for a long-term personal leave of absence from my demanding corporate accounting firm in Boston and flew straight down to Florida. I spent every single day and every long, quiet night sitting right beside his narrow mechanical bed. I brought my laptop and managed the entire portfolio of 20 rental properties from a small, uncomfortable plastic chair, listening to the steady, rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor and the soft hum of the oxygen machine. During those final, agonizing, devastating weeks, absolutely nobody from the Patterson family ever called. Not a single time. My father, Robert, did not bother to pick up the phone to check on his dying older brother. My mother, Linda, was completely consumed with hosting extravagant country club luncheons and obsessing over her superficial social status. Savannah and Trent were far too busy desperately trying to hide their massive, toxic financial failures behind expensive dinners and leased luxury European sports cars. I was the absolute only person in the world paying for his round-the-clock medical care. I aggressively paid the exorbitant hospice bills, the specialized private nurses, and the incredibly expensive pain management medications directly out of the real estate limited liability company we had built together. It was never a burden to me. It was the absolute greatest, profound honor of my entire life to care for the only man who had ever truly seen my worth and treated me like a human being. Uncle Thomas passed away on a quiet, incredibly still Tuesday morning, while the Florida sun was just beginning to rise over the palm trees. I was holding his frail, calloused hand when he took his final shallow breath. The heavy silence that completely filled the sterile white hospice room after the medical machines finally flatlined was incredibly heavy and deeply suffocating. I sat there in that uncomfortable plastic chair for a very long time, crying softly and mourning the profound loss of the only genuine parent I had ever really known. He had completely saved my spirit when my biological family systematically destroyed my self-esteem, and I had saved his entire life legacy when they cruelly left him to drown in debt. We had protected each other from the incredibly toxic people who shared our last name. Eventually, I had to pull myself together and make the terrible phone call I had been dreading all morning. I walked out into the cold, sterile hallway of the hospice center and dialed my father's private cell phone number. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding incredibly annoyed at the unexpected morning interruption. When I clearly told him that his older brother was officially gone, there was absolutely no gasp of sorrow. There were no sudden tears. There was only a cold, sharp, calculating pause on the other end of the line. My father simply cleared his throat and immediately shifted into aggressive logistical planning. He told me with absolute authority that Thomas needed to be flown back to Boston for the funeral immediately. He insisted that the formal memorial service had to be held at their massive, prestigious, historic church in our wealthy suburban hometown. I knew exactly why he wanted this, and it made my blood boil. It had absolutely nothing to do with honoring his deceased brother. It was entirely about maintaining their fragile public image. They desperately needed to play the role of the tragic grieving family in front of their wealthy, superficial socialite friends. They needed the public sympathy to distract from the quiet rumors about Trent's failing business. I handled all the incredibly complicated transportation arrangements myself. I paid the massive fees to transport the casket across the country, and I funded the entire expensive funeral completely out of my own pocket because my parents loudly claimed their liquid cash was temporarily tied up in investments. I flew back to Massachusetts a few days later, feeling a profound dark emptiness in my chest. But the true horror show had not even begun. When I finally walked into that grand historic church on the morning of the funeral, the sheer level of absolute disgusting hypocrisy I witnessed nearly made me physically sick to my stomach. The massive echoing sanctuary was completely filled with incredibly elaborate towering floral arrangements that my mother had aggressively ordered on credit just to impress the arriving guests. White orchids and expensive lilies spilled over the mahogany pews, creating an absurdly lavish atmosphere that Uncle Thomas would have absolutely hated. My mother, Linda, stood perfectly positioned in the main grand foyer, wearing a flawless, tailored black designer dress, clutching a delicate vintage lace handkerchief. She wept theatrically and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes whenever a wealthy neighbor, a local politician, or a prominent business associate walked through the heavy wooden doors. She accepted their warm, heartfelt condolences with practiced, elegant sorrow, whispering loudly about how incredibly difficult and deeply devastating this sudden, unexpected loss was for the Patterson family. It was a flawless, sickeningly perfect performance designed entirely to harvest social sympathy. My father, Robert, stood right beside her, wearing a dark custom expensive suit, solemnly shaking hands and accepting sympathetic pats on the shoulder from his country club golfing buddies. He looked exactly like a tragic, stoic patriarch, bravely bearing the incredibly heavy burden of a lost brother. Nobody in that crowded, echoing church knew the absolute vile truth. Nobody knew that my father had brutally slammed the heavy wooden door in that exact same brother's face when he was actively dying of cancer and begging for his life. Nobody knew that my father had refused to lend him a single dollar to save him from foreclosure. But the absolute worst, most deeply offensive offenders in the entire building were Savannah and Trent. Savannah arrived at the church 30 minutes late, ensuring that everyone was already seated so they could watch her dramatic entrance. She wore a stunning, tight-fitting black couture outfit and a massive, dramatic black hat that looked like something pulled directly out of a wealthy fashion magazine photo shoot. She clung incredibly tightly to Trent's arms, sobbing loudly and dramatically as they slowly walked down the long center aisle. Trent looked incredibly serious and somber, holding her hand tight against his chest and offering her deep, fake, comforting whispers. They completely ignored me as they walked by and took their places in the very front row, the prime prestigious seats reserved for the closest, most deeply devoted family members. I sat completely alone in the shadows of the third row. I wore a simple, modest black dress that I had bought at a discount store years ago. I did not sob loudly. I did not seek any attention from the passing ushers. I just sat in the quiet, cold shadows, gripping my purse and watching my toxic biological family turn my beloved uncle's solemn funeral into a disgusting, self-serving theatrical production. The absolute climax of their sickening performance came when the minister invited family members to share their memories. I felt my stomach completely drop as Savannah actually had the unmitigated sheer nerve to stand up from her front row seat and walk slowly up to the polished wooden pulpit. She stood in front of the entire silent congregation, gripped the edges of the heavy podium, and delivered a tearful, completely fabricated speech about deep family loyalty. She spoke beautifully and tragically about how much Uncle Tommy had meant to her growing up. She shared fake, deeply sentimental stories about childhood holidays that never actually happened and completely invented memories of his supposed brilliant life advice to her. She looked out at the completely captivated audience with glistening, fake, tear-filled eyes and talked extensively about the unbreakable sacred bond of the Patterson family. She actually said into the microphone that even though physical distance had separated them in his final few years, their hearts had always been completely and totally connected by an invisible thread of pure love. I sat in my hard wooden pew, digging my fingernails so deeply into my palms that they almost drew blood. The sheer toxic audacity of her flowing lies was physically suffocating. I stared at her perfectly made-up face, illuminated by the stained glass windows, and I felt a wave of pure, intense rage wash over me. This was the exact same arrogant woman who had laughed cruelly in his face and called him a worthless financial liability just 3 years ago. This was the exact same woman who had loudly demanded he be thrown out of their house so his messy cancer diagnosis would not ruin their pristine credit scores or their perfect dinner party. And now she was standing in a holy place, wearing incredibly expensive clothes, funded by massive toxic credit card debt, actively milking his tragic death for public social sympathy and attention. When she finally finished her disgusting speech, Trent stood up quickly and walked to the pulpit. He gently put his arm around his supposedly weeping wife and guided her slowly back to her premium seat. The entire crowded church murmured with deep, profound admiration for their beautiful, tragic display of family devotion. My mother dabbed her eyes perfectly for the audience. My father nodded solemnly at Trent. They had successfully and completely fooled every single person in the room. They had expertly painted themselves as the loving, devoted, supportive relatives who were utterly heartbroken and completely devastated by this profound loss. As the long, heavy service finally concluded, and the hundreds of guests slowly began to file out of the sanctuary toward the catered reception hall, I remained completely seated and perfectly still in my pew. I watched Savannah and Trent huddle closely with my parents near the front altar where the shadows were deep. Their theatrical public tears had instantly and magically vanished the very moment the audience finally turned their backs. I could clearly see the cold, greedy calculation rapidly returning to their sharp eyes. I could see Trent urgently whispering to my father, gesturing aggressively toward his buzzing cell phone. The fake mourning period was already officially over for them. The beautiful, tragic performance had served its exact intended purpose, and now they were rapidly moving on to the actual, real reason they had put on this massive, expensive show in the first place. They were completely ready to aggressively divide the financial spoils of a dead man. They were absolutely certain that the 20 highly valuable rental properties down in Florida were just sitting there completely abandoned, waiting to be easily claimed by the next of kin to wipe out all of Trent's massive toxic debt. They had absolutely no idea that they were eagerly, happily walking straight into a devastating legal trap that had been set perfectly in place 3 long years ago. The days immediately following Uncle Thomas's funeral were some of the darkest and most exhausting days of my entire life. While my parents and my sister Savannah went right back to their busy social lives in Boston, I returned to my quiet little condo, feeling completely hollowed out by grief. I had spent the last 2 years actively managing my uncle's care, watching him slowly fade away and protecting his financial legacy. Now that he was actually gone, the silence in my apartment was overwhelmingly loud, but my family did not allow me the basic human dignity of mourning in peace. Less than 48 hours after they had performed their sickeningly theatrical display of fake tears at the church, my mother Linda was already calling my cell phone with aggressive demands. She did not call to ask how I was coping with the loss. She called to remind me that corporate tax deadlines were rapidly approaching. She told me that Trent was under an immense amount of pressure at his wealth management firm, and that it was my absolute duty as a supportive sister to finalize his complicated corporate tax returns immediately. My mother insisted that Trent was dealing with a minor routine audit and needed his certified public accountant to properly organize his chaotic files before the federal regulators arrived. She spoke to me with that familiar, sharp tone of absolute authority, entirely expecting me to just swallow my grief, sit down at my desk, and do exactly what I was told for free. For a brief moment, I honestly considered telling her no. I considered telling her to hire a stranger to clean up her fraudulent son-in-law's massive financial messes. But my professional curiosity and my deep suspicion overrode my exhaustion. I knew Trent's business was already a fragile house of cards. I knew he was drowning in highly leveraged toxic debt. If federal regulators were truly auditing his firm, I needed to see exactly how close he was to total financial ruin. So I agreed to do the taxes one final time. I told my mother to have Trent upload all of his internal corporate documents, raw bank statements, and digital receipts to a secure shared cloud drive. That Friday night, I sat down at the small wooden desk in my living room. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee, opened my laptop, and logged into the shared portal Trent had haphazardly set up for me. As a trained financial auditor, I can tell you that numbers never lie. People lie constantly, but the mathematics behind their choices always reveal the absolute, unvarnished truth. As I began digging through Trent's digital folders, the sheer scale of his financial catastrophe became horrifyingly clear. This was not a minor routine audit. Trent was under a massive aggressive investigation by federal financial authorities. I found glaring discrepancies in his client trust accounts. I found desperate wire transfers, moving money between entirely separate shell companies just to cover his immediate margin calls. I saw exorbitant personal expenses, luxury car leases, country club dues, and five-star hotel stays aggressively miscategorized as essential business operations. His firm was entirely insolvent. He was actively burning through borrowed money just to maintain the incredibly fake illusion of immense wealth that my parents so desperately worshipped. Trent was, quite literally, weeks away from a total public collapse that would likely end in severe criminal fraud charges. As I sat there staring at the damning spreadsheets, my heart pounded with a cold, heavy rhythm. I was meticulously downloading and backing up all of these toxic financial records to an external hard drive when I stumbled across something that completely stopped the breath in my throat. Trent had always been incredibly sloppy with his digital organization. In his frantic rush to dump all of his corporate files into the shared drive for me to clean up, he had accidentally dragged and dropped a personal email archive folder into the main directory. The folder was boldly labeled Estate Strategy. I stared at the glowing blue icon on my computer screen. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I should probably just ignore it and focus solely on the tax preparation. But the date on the folder was from just a few weeks ago, right when Uncle Thomas was being moved into the end-of-life hospice facility. My hands actually trembled as I moved my cursor over the folder and clicked to open it. Inside was a long, heavily detailed email thread between Trent Savannah and my parents, Robert and Linda. As I began reading the messages, the last remaining shred of hope I had that my family possessed any basic human decency completely evaporated. The sheer vile greed radiating from the screen was physically nauseating. The first email was from Trent to my father, sent late at night while Uncle Thomas was literally fighting for his final breaths in Orlando. Trent wrote with raw, unhinged desperation. He explicitly admitted to my father that his firm was facing imminent federal collapse. He confessed that his corporate credit lines were entirely frozen and that if he did not secure a massive injection of liquid capital within the next 90 days, the authorities would seize his assets and pursue criminal charges. Trent was begging my father for a multi-million-dollar bailout. My father's reply, sent early the very next morning, made my blood run absolutely cold. Robert did not express any concern about his son-in-law's massive financial fraud. He did not reprimand Trent for lying to his daughter. Instead, my father offered a completely ruthless and calculating solution. Robert wrote that they were completely out of liquid cash because they had drained their retirement accounts for the wedding. But then, he explicitly laid out his master plan. He told Trent not to panic. He wrote that his older brother Thomas was currently in hospice and only had a few days left to live. Robert confidently stated that because Thomas had never married and had no children, he died without any direct heirs. My father assured Trent that under standard state laws, the entirety of Thomas Patterson's estate, including those 20 highly valuable working-class rental properties down in Florida, would automatically and easily default to him as the sole surviving brother. I sat back in my chair feeling a wave of pure, profound disgust wash over my entire body. My father was actively plotting to use his own dying brother's life work as a convenient financial life raft for a criminal. He had brutally slammed the door in Thomas's face when the man begged for a small bridge loan to save his properties from bank foreclosure 3 years ago. My parents had proudly abandoned him to die in financial ruin. But now that Thomas was actually taking his last breaths, my father was practically drooling over the massive equity he mistakenly believed was just waiting to be claimed. The email thread only grew more sickening from there. Savannah replied to the group thread a few hours later. Her message was a masterpiece of sheer toxic entitlement. She did not express a single word of sorrow or grief for her dying uncle. She did not even mention his name with any respect. Savannah immediately started demanding to know exactly how fast the probate process would take. She wrote that she had already contacted a commercial real estate broker in Florida to get aggressive appraisals on the 20 houses. Savannah complained that they needed the cash out immediately because her country club friends were starting to notice that she had not bought any new designer clothes this season. She explicitly told my parents that they needed to sign all 20 properties directly over to Trent's holding company the very second the death certificate was issued, so they could aggressively liquidate the houses and save their wealthy aesthetic. My mother, Linda, chimed in with the final devastating message in the chain. She completely agreed with Savannah's aggressive timeline. Linda wrote that Trent was a brilliant man who just needed a little family support during a tough market correction. She assured Trent and Savannah that she and Robert would gladly sign away their rights to the entire Florida portfolio to ensure Savannah's perfect life remained completely uninterrupted. But the very last paragraph of my mother's email was specifically and cruelly dedicated to me. Linda explicitly instructed the group to keep the entire estate strategy an absolute total secret from Chloe. She wrote that I was incredibly sensitive and far too emotional about dead relatives. She told them that because I was just a simple, quiet bookkeeper, I would probably start asking annoying legal questions and make a huge, unnecessary fuss about fairness or honoring Thomas's actual wishes. My mother clearly stated that they would just use me to do Trent's taxes for free, and then they would quietly execute the estate transfer behind my back. She actually wrote that keeping me in the dark was for my own good, because I simply did not have the vision to understand high-level family wealth building. I sat alone in the dark, quiet space of my living room, reading that specific paragraph over and over again. My mother, the woman who had packed my belongings into garbage bags when I was 13 years old, was actively plotting to steal a dead man's estate and intentionally trying to ensure I remained a blind, obedient servant to their greed. They genuinely believed they were incredibly smart. They genuinely believed they had constructed the absolute perfect, brilliant scheme to erase Trent's massive toxic debt and secure their glorious wealthy future. They were all so entirely arrogant and so completely blinded by their own extreme greed that they had not bothered to check a single public county record in the state of Florida for the past 3 years. They had absolutely no idea that Uncle Thomas did not own those 20 rental properties anymore. They had no idea that the massive multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio they were currently salivating over had been legally and completely sold in October of 2021. They had no idea that I had drained every single penny of my own life savings and taken on massive personal debt to save those houses from aggressive bank foreclosure when they had callously refused to help. Most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that every single one of those 20 valuable Florida deeds was already sitting safely and securely in a fireproof safe inside my apartment, clearly and permanently registered under my own private limited liability company. I did not cry. I did not scream or throw things across the room. The intense pain of their profound betrayal was completely eclipsed by a deep, cold, calculating sense of absolute clarity. I felt an incredible surge of pure, righteous power flow through my veins. For my entire life, I had been the invisible, forgotten child. I had been the convenient scapegoat, the unpaid worker, the quiet girl who took their abuse and cleaned up their endless messes. But sitting at that desk, staring at their vile, greedy emails, I finally realized that I held the ultimate, devastating trump card. They were eagerly planning to walk into a formal legal inheritance meeting, entirely expecting to walk out as multimillionaires. They were fully preparing to sit across a mahogany table and proudly graciously accept the hard-earned wealth of a man they had treated like absolute garbage. They had built an entire fragile, desperate future on the blind assumption that they were entitled to the fruits of Uncle Thomas's labor. I carefully exported the entire email thread, converting every single message into a secure, permanent document. I saved the files onto 3 separate encrypted flash drives, ensuring that their vile plot was perfectly and permanently preserved. I printed out hard copies of Trent's fraudulent corporate tax records, highlighting the exact massive numbers that proved he was facing imminent federal ruin. I neatly placed all of the devastating evidence into a thick manila folder right next to the certified Florida property deeds that proved I was the sole exclusive owner of the entire real estate empire. I decided right then that I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to finish organizing Trent's chaotic tax files just enough to maintain my cover. I was going to stay completely silent and perfectly obedient. I would let them continue to believe that their brilliant master plan was working flawlessly. I would let them strut into that estate attorney's office wearing their expensive designer clothes and their smug, arrogant smiles. I was going to let them build their beautiful, fragile house of cards as high as it could possibly go, because I knew with absolute certainty that when the time finally came for the lawyer to open his thick leather binder, I was going to be the one to breathe in deep and blow their entire delusional world straight to the ground. I calmly closed my laptop, turned off the desk lamp, and went to sleep feeling perfectly and completely ready for war. We are brought seamlessly back to the exact moment this entire story opened. The air inside David Sterling's pristine law office was so incredibly thick and heavy that it was genuinely difficult to draw a normal breath. I sat perfectly still in my plush leather chair with my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched my family processing the absolute destruction of their grand, wealthy illusion. The arrogant, confident smiles they had worn when they first strutted into this conference room had completely vanished. They had marched into this office entirely expecting to be handed a multi-million-dollar real estate empire to wipe out Trent's massive toxic debt. Instead, they were staring at a solid brick wall of legal reality. Attorney David Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at my family with an expression of mild professional boredom. He was a man who had seen decades of greedy relatives fighting over inheritances, but even he seemed quietly disgusted by their behavior. He reached out with both hands and slowly slid the heavy stack of Florida property warranty deeds directly across the polished mahogany table. He placed them right in front of Trent and Savannah. Right next to those deeds, he placed the official state-registered operating agreement for a holding company. As I was explaining before the interruption, David Sterling said, his voice perfectly calm and measured. Thomas Patterson did not own any of these 20 residential properties at the time of his passing. He executed a legally binding transfer of all real estate assets in October of 2021. He transferred them in their entirety to a limited liability company, and as you can clearly see on page 4 of the operating agreement right there in front of you, the sole managing member holding 100% absolute ownership of that company is Chloe Patterson. My sister Savannah stared down at the documents. Her fake baked-on tan seemed to literally drain from her skin, leaving her face a sickly shade of ashen gray. She looked at my name printed in bold black ink on the official state documents. Her mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her defeat. My father, Robert, gripped the edges of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. His chest was heaving. He looked at me as if I was a complete stranger who had somehow infiltrated his life. "This is completely impossible," my father practically growled. His voice was shaking with a mixture of pure rage and total disbelief. "You are just a desk accountant. You do not have the money to secure 20 houses. You manipulated a sick, dying man into giving you his life savings because you are a jealous, bitter person. We are going to contest this. We are going to sue you and take everything back." I did not flinch. I did not shrink down into my chair the way I had done for 28 years of my life. I sat up perfectly straight, and I looked my father directly in his furious eyes. "There was no manipulation," I said. My voice was dead calm, cutting through his aggressive bluster like a sharp blade. "And there will be absolutely no lawsuit, because you have no legal ground to stand on. You want to know how I got these properties? I bought them. I drained my entire life savings, every single penny I earned from working grueling 60-hour weeks while you all went on luxury vacations. I took out a massive personal hard money loan to pay off the bank arrears and the back taxes. I took on hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest debt to save Uncle Thomas from aggressive bank foreclosure." My mother, Linda, let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, pressing her hand to her pearl necklace. "Why would you do something so incredibly stupid?" my mother hissed, her face contorted in disgust. "He was bankrupt. He was a terrible businessman. I did it because he was drowning, and you completely abandoned him." I fired back, refusing to let her control the narrative for one more second. "Do you remember that Sunday dinner in 2021? Do you remember when he stood in your formal dining room, dying of colon cancer, actively begging you for a temporary bridge loan to save his life work? You told him to leave because his sickness was ruining your perfect evening. You told him he was a financial liability. You slammed the door in his face and went right back to eating your expensive prime rib." I turned my gaze slowly from my parents to my sister. Savannah was physically trembling now, gripping Trent's arm for a support that was no longer there. "You thought you could swoop in like vultures to pick at a dead man's bones?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "You abandoned him when he needed you most, and you completely ignored his existence for 2 years. But the absolute second you realized he was taking his final breaths, you started drooling over his equity. You plotted to steal his estate to save yourselves. But Uncle Thomas was not a fool. He knew exactly who abandoned him, and he knew exactly who saved him. You own nothing, Savannah. You get absolutely nothing." Trent slammed his fist down onto the mahogany table. The loud sound echoed sharply against the wood paneling of the room. He was sweating profusely, and his expensive designer tie looked suddenly very tight around his neck. "This is a massive scam," Trent shouted, pointing an aggressive finger at me. "You're holding out on this family. You are hoarding all of that rental cash flow while we are going through a temporary market correction. You know exactly how much Savannah and I need that liquid capital to secure my firm. You are deliberately destroying my wealth management business out of pure spite." I looked at Trent and I actually smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, calculated smile of a professional auditor who had finally cornered a massive fraud. "Your wealth management business is not going through a temporary market correction, Trent," I said plainly. "Your business is a completely fraudulent shell game." I reached down into my leather bag and pulled out the second thick manila folder I had brought with me. I lifted it high and tossed it directly into the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sliding right over the property deeds and stopping inches away from my father's hands. "What is this?" my father demanded, staring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "Those are Trent's true financial records," I said loudly, ensuring every single person in the room could hear me perfectly clearly. "Not the fake doctored spreadsheets he brings to your country club dinners. Not the glossy brochures he uses to scam new investors. Those are the raw, unedited bank statements, the massive hard money loan contracts, and the aggressive margin call notices that he accidentally uploaded to my secure tax portal last week." Trent's face went entirely pale. The aggressive tough guy posture completely vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying realization of a cornered criminal. He lunged forward, trying to grab the folder, but my father snatched it up first. "Let me explain it to you in very simple terms, since you told me I do not understand high-level corporate finance," I said, looking directly at my father. "Your brilliant, successful son-in-law is completely and functionally bankrupt. He is completely drowning in highly leveraged, toxic debt. He has been taking out desperate high-interest loans just to pay off other desperate high-interest loans. He has been aggressively miscategorizing luxury personal expenses like Savannah's designer clothes and his European sports cars as essential corporate operations. He is entirely insolvent." My father frantically flipped through the printed pages. He was not an accountant, but the bright red numbers and the aggressive legal warnings from federal banks were incredibly easy to understand. I watched my father's hands begin to physically shake as the sheer, horrifying reality of the situation finally penetrated his arrogant, thick skull. "He is not waiting on a delayed overseas wire transfer," I continued, my voice echoing in the silent room. "He is currently facing a massive, aggressive audit by federal financial regulators. They are looking into his client trust accounts because the money is simply missing. He is literally weeks away from a total public collapse and probable federal fraud charges." My mother let out a loud, horrific wail. She turned to look at Trent with eyes so incredibly wide, they looked like they might completely pop out of her head. The absolute terrifying realization that her wealthy country club friends would soon read about her son-in-law's federal fraud charges in the local newspaper was breaking her mind. "Trent!" my mother shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me she made these numbers up. We emptied our entire retirement accounts for your wedding. We paid $150,000 for your country club reception because you told us you were building a massive corporate legacy. Tell me you have our money." Trent could not even look at her. He stared down at the polished wood of the table, his breathing shallow and rapid. He swallowed hard, but absolutely no words came out of his mouth. His silence was the loudest, most devastating confession in the world. Savannah suddenly pushed her chair back violently. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She turned on her husband with an absolute vicious fury. "You told me we were rich," Savannah screamed, hitting him squarely on the shoulder. "You told me we were buying a summer house in Aspen. You told me the federal regulators were just doing a routine standard check. You lied to me. You made me look like a complete fool in front of everyone at the club." "I was trying to fix it," Trent stammered, his voice completely pathetic and small. "I just needed a bridge loan. I just needed Chloe to take out the second mortgage on her condo and sign over the Florida properties. I could have saved the firm if she was not so incredibly stubborn and selfish." "You were going to use my money to fund a criminal enterprise," I interrupted, shutting down his pathetic excuses instantly. "You were going to drag me down with you, and you..." I pointed directly at my parents, who were now clutching each other in absolute financial terror. "You were completely willing to let him do it. You literally sat in your kitchen and told me to mortgage my only safe home to bail out this fraud. You sent me emails actively plotting to steal Uncle Thomas's estate while he was literally dying in a hospice bed just so you could maintain your fake upper-class country club aesthetic. We did not know. My father lied desperately. His face was shining with nervous sweat. Chloe, you have to believe me. We had absolutely no idea the debt was this toxic. We thought he was just having a tough quarter. You did not want to know. I corrected him firmly. I printed out his balance sheets for you months ago. I laid the red numbers on your desk, and you completely refused to look at them. You told me I lacked vision. You told me I was just a quiet, bitter bookkeeper who did not understand wealth. You chose to completely ignore the truth because the truth was ugly, and you only care about things that look pretty on the outside. The complete and utter devastation in the room was absolute. My parents had sacrificed their entire long-term future, their retirement and their financial safety net to fund a ridiculous luxury wedding for a man who was actively scamming them. They had absolutely nothing left. Their home equity was maxed out. Their credit cards were heavily burdened, and the golden son-in-law they had constantly bragged about was about to be investigated by federal authorities. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and now that illusion was completely burned to ash. I reached into my purse and pulled out one final single sheet of paper. I slid it gently across the table toward Trent. "What is this?" Trent whispered, his voice completely broken. "That is my official formal letter of resignation." I stated clearly. I am officially resigning as your corporate certified public accountant, effective immediately. I have legally submitted this same notice to the federal tax authorities, along with a massive, heavily documented file stating that I do not verify or stand by any of the financial records you provided to me. I will not be your shield. I will not be your scapegoat. You are completely and entirely on your own. Trent dropped his head into his hands, completely defeated. Savannah was sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. My parents were staring at the fraudulent financial documents, completely paralyzed by the sheer horror of their ruined future. For 28 years, they had treated me like a glorified secretary. They had mocked my practical choices. They had demanded my money, my time, and my absolute silent obedience. They had called me ungrateful and selfish for simply trying to build a safe, independent life. But standing in that law office, looking at the complete wreckage of their toxic entitlement, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, incredible sense of peace. I picked up my purse and pushed my chair in perfectly straight. Attorney David Sterling sat quietly at the head of the table, watching the entire scene with an expression of deep professional satisfaction. He gave me a very small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. "Good luck with the federal audits, Trent," I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the large room. "And Savannah, maybe you should start looking for a job. I hear the country club is hiring waitresses." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. I did not look back at my mother crying over her lost retirement. I did not look back at my father, realizing his social reputation was completely destroyed. I walked out into the bright, warm sunshine of the afternoon, completely free. I had saved my uncle's legacy. I had built a highly profitable real estate empire, and I had finally permanently removed myself from a family that had only ever wanted to use me. The invisible daughter was finally gone, and I was never ever going back. When I walked out of David Sterling's polished mahogany conference room, the heavy Boston air felt entirely different. For the first time in 28 years, I was breathing clean oxygen. I walked to my 10-year-old car and simply sat behind the steering wheel, listening to the absolute profound silence of my cell phone. There were no more aggressive text messages from my mother demanding my obedience. There were no more frantic voicemails from my father commanding me to take out a second mortgage on my modest condominium. The massive psychological chains they had wrapped around my neck since childhood had completely shattered the moment I threw Trent's fraudulent financial records onto that table. I had exposed their golden son-in-law as a completely bankrupt con artist, and I had proven that I was the sole legal owner of Uncle Thomas's multi-million-dollar Florida real estate empire. I honestly believed that the explosive confrontation in the law office was the final chapter of our toxic family history. I assumed they would retreat to their massive suburban mansion and quietly drown in their own profound humiliation. I severely underestimated the sheer terrifying depth of Trent's desperate criminality and my parents' bottomless capacity for self-destruction. The legal fallout from that afternoon was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. I had spent years analyzing complex corporate tax returns, so I knew perfectly well that Trent's wealth management firm was fundamentally insolvent. I knew he was facing a massive federal audit. What I did not know was the extreme, incredibly illegal lengths he had gone to in the final frantic days before Uncle Thomas officially passed away. Trent was not just a terrible, arrogant businessman. He was an active, cornered criminal who realized the federal authorities were just days away from discovering the millions of dollars he had stolen from his own wealthy clients. He desperately needed a massive, immediate injection of liquid capital to replace the missing trust funds before the government agents kicked down his office doors. He could not secure a legitimate bank loan because his commercial credit was entirely destroyed. He was completely out of options until my greedy parents practically handed him a loaded weapon. While Uncle Thomas was lying in an Orlando hospice facility, literally fighting for his final agonizing breaths, my father Robert had excitedly assured Trent that a massive financial windfall was coming. My father had confidently promised his son-in-law that because Thomas had no wife and no children, the entire estate would automatically seamlessly default to him as the sole surviving brother. My parents had actively agreed to immediately sign all 20 of those highly valuable working-class rental properties directly over to Trent the absolute second the death certificate was printed. They were practically drooling over the equity of a dead man they had completely and cruelly abandoned 3 years prior. They believed they had constructed the perfect, brilliant strategy to save Trent's failing business and preserve Savannah's glamorous, wealthy lifestyle. But Trent was far too panicked to wait for the slow, methodical process of the state probate courts. He needed hard cash immediately, and he decided to force the universe to bend to his will. In the week leading up to the reading of the estate, Trent committed a series of incredibly reckless and arrogant federal felonies. He approached a shadowy, aggressive group of unregulated hard money lenders. These were not traditional commercial bankers who follow strict protocols. These were ruthless private financiers who issue massive high-interest loans based entirely on hard real estate collateral. Trent walked into their private offices wearing his custom-tailored Italian suits and his expensive gold watches, completely projecting the false image of a highly successful corporate wealth manager. He presented these private lenders with a massive stack of official-looking legal documents. But every single piece of paper in that thick leather binder was entirely fabricated. Trent had pulled the old, outdated public tax records for Uncle Thomas's 20 Florida properties from before the year 2021. He deliberately printed out the old deeds from before I had used my entire life savings to rescue the portfolio from bank foreclosure. Using his access to sophisticated corporate software, Trent meticulously forged a complex series of fake ownership transfers. He outright forged my Uncle Thomas's signature on a fake preliminary trust document. He forged my father Robert's signature, claiming that Robert was already the legally established executor of the estate. He drafted completely fake preliminary probate approvals. Trent used the 20 working-class residential homes that actually legally belonged entirely to my private limited liability company as direct collateral to secure a massive, immediate multi-million-dollar hard money loan. He committed this massive, undeniable wire and real estate fraud because he possessed the ultimate blinding arrogance of an entitled man. Trent genuinely, completely believed his own lies. He was so absolutely certain that my parents controlled the Patterson family dynamic that he considered the Florida portfolio to be his own personal property. He fully assumed that during our formal meeting with attorney David Sterling, I would simply lower my head, obey my father's aggressive commands, and blindly sign the real physical property deeds directly over to his corporate shell company. Trent gambled his entire life and his literal freedom on the pathetic assumption that I was a weak, obedient, invisible sister who would simply hand him an empire to keep the peace. He planned to take the real, authentic property deeds after the meeting and quietly, seamlessly swap them with the forged documents he had given the hard money lenders before anyone noticed the dates were completely wrong. But the universe has a very beautiful way of punishing absolute, unchecked arrogance. Because I had sat in that law office and completely refused to hand over my legal property, Trent's massive criminal gamble instantly, spectacularly collapsed. He walked out of David Sterling's office with absolutely nothing but the crushing, terrifying realization that he had just pledged 20 houses he did not own to a group of incredibly dangerous private lenders. And those private hard money lenders were not fools. When you deal in millions of dollars of unregulated cash, you aggressively verify your collateral. Just a few short days after our explosive family showdown, the lender's legal team ran a deep, comprehensive secondary title search on the Florida portfolio. The private lenders discovered the exact same truth that had completely destroyed my family in the conference room. They pulled the actual legitimate state records. They clearly saw the legally binding warranty deeds from October 2021. They saw my private limited liability company listed as the sole exclusive registered owner of all 20 properties. They immediately realized that the thick stack of documents Trent had confidently handed them were nothing but elaborate digital forgeries. The massive multi-million-dollar collateral they had loaned against was an absolute ghost. The lenders did not send a polite warning letter or request a gentle corporate mediation. They were completely furious that an arrogant wealth manager had attempted to scam them. They immediately gathered all the forged signatures, the fake probate documents, and the fraudulent commercial loan applications, and handed every single piece of evidence directly over to the federal financial authorities. The house of cards did not just slowly fall apart. It violently exploded. On a quiet, crisp Tuesday morning, federal agents arrived at Trent's flashy, expensive corporate office building in downtown Boston. They walked past the glass doors and the expensive modern art, completely shutting down the entire operation. They executed massive federal search warrants, walking out of the building with heavy cardboard boxes filled with physical files and dozens of computer hard drives. Trent was formally and aggressively charged with multiple severe federal crimes, including massive wire fraud, aggressive bank fraud, and interstate real estate fraud. Because the evidence was completely overwhelming and explicitly documented, the authorities immediately moved to freeze every single one of his personal and corporate bank accounts. They seized his leased luxury vehicles. They seized his expensive overseas investments. The wealthy, glamorous image he had carefully bought with highly leveraged toxic debt completely evaporated into thin air overnight. He was suddenly facing decades in a federal penitentiary. This is the exact moment where my parents, Robert and Linda, made their final, most absolutely pathetic mistake. Any rational, normal human being would have immediately cut all ties with a criminal son-in-law who had actively forged family signatures and lied about millions of dollars. But my parents were not rational people. They were completely poisoned by their desperate, terrifying need to maintain their upper-class country club aesthetic. They simply could not mentally bear the intense public humiliation of their wealthy friends, seeing their golden, beautiful daughter, Savannah, married to a convicted federal felon in a bright orange prison jumpsuit. They were far more terrified of neighborhood gossip than they were of actual financial ruin. My parents foolishly decided they had to save Trent to save their own social reputation. They scrambled to hire a team of elite, wildly expensive criminal defense attorneys to fight the federal fraud charges. But there was a massive, unavoidable problem. My parents had already completely drained their entire lifelong retirement accounts to pay for Savannah's ridiculous $150,000 luxury country club wedding. Their platinum credit cards were completely maxed out. They had absolutely zero liquid cash left to pay the massive six-figure legal retainers required by the elite defense team. So, in a final act of pure desperate delusion, my parents were forced to put their pristine, massive New England colonial home on the real estate market. They sold the beautiful, sprawling suburban mansion that they loved far more than they had ever loved me. Because they needed the cash immediately to keep Trent out of a federal holding cell, they had to accept an aggressive lowball offer, selling their dream home at a massive, heartbreaking loss. I watched from a quiet distance as the heavy moving trucks pulled up to the house I grew up in. I watched them carry out the expensive mahogany dining table where my father had brutally ordered me to mortgage my condo. I watched them pack up the crystal glasses they had used to toast Savannah's fake success. My parents liquidated their expensive jewelry, they sold their secondary cars, and they completely emptied their entire existence to fund the legal defense of a con artist. They were forced to move into a cramped, dark, depressing two-bedroom apartment on the complete opposite side of the city, far away from their beloved wealthy country club friends who had entirely stopped returning their frantic phone calls. They sacrificed everything they had left in the world to protect Trent. And after they had completely bankrupted their entire existence, after they had lost their home, their status, and their dignity, Trent showed them exactly what kind of man he truly was. Trent knew the federal case against him was completely airtight. He knew that even with the expensive defense attorneys my parents had destroyed their lives to hire, he was going to spend a very long time in a federal prison. He had absolutely no intention of facing the consequences of his own arrogance. In the middle of the dark, cold night, just 3 weeks before his mandatory federal indictment hearing, Trent completely vanished. He packed a single duffel bag with whatever loose, untraceable cash he had managed to hide from the authorities, and he fled the state entirely. He did not leave a note. He did not say goodbye to the family that had just sold their home to save him. He completely abandoned the massive, tangled legal mess he had created, deliberately leaving my parents personally responsible for the remaining massive legal bills they had signed for. He jumped bail and disappeared into the wind, running away like an absolute coward to avoid his inevitable prosecution. And he completely abandoned Savannah, my beautiful golden sister who had spent her entire life collecting expensive things and looking down on my practical, quiet existence, was left with absolutely nothing. Her glamorous, fake corporate husband was an international fugitive. Her designer bank accounts were permanently frozen by the federal government. She was completely functionally bankrupt and entirely alone. Savannah had no practical skills, no career, and absolutely no independent ability to support herself. She was forced to pack up her few remaining unseized belongings and move directly into that cramped, depressing two-bedroom apartment with my ruined, bitter parents. The three of them were completely trapped together in a tiny space, entirely consumed by the massive toxic wreckage of their own endless greed. They had tried to steal the hard-earned legacy of a dying man to fund their arrogant delusion, and in the end, that exact arrogance had systematically and permanently destroyed every single thing they held dear. I am standing right now on the wide wooden balcony of a newly renovated coastal property in Central Florida, watching the warm orange sun dip slowly below the horizon. The evening air is incredibly soft and heavy with the scent of salt water and blooming jasmine. The gentle, rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline fills the quiet space around me. I take a deep, steady breath of the clean air and let it out slowly. For the first time in my entire 28 years of life, my shoulders are completely relaxed. There is absolutely no knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. There is no frantic buzzing of a cell phone bringing fresh demands from a toxic family. There is only peace. It has been several months since that explosive final showdown in David Sterling's pristine mahogany law office. I did not stay in Boston long after watching my parents and my sister completely self-destruct under the crushing weight of their own massive greed. I quietly packed up my modest, practical condo, listed it on the market, and sold it to a nice young couple starting their own life. I officially packed my bags, handed in the keys to my old, cold life, and permanently relocated to the bright, warm coast of Florida. I left the bitter, freezing New England winters behind, and more importantly, I completely left the dark, toxic shadow of the Patterson family name. Moving here was the absolute best decision I have ever made. I now live just a few miles away from the very first working-class rental home that Uncle Thomas ever purchased. I kept every single one of his original 20 properties completely intact, but I did not stop there. Using my professional financial background and the steady, healthy profits we generated, I successfully and aggressively expanded the real estate portfolio. We now own and operate over 40 residential properties across the county. But I have never strayed from Uncle Thomas's original pure vision. I do not flip houses for quick, ruthless corporate profit. I completely renovate them, ensuring they have safe new roofs, modern efficient appliances, and clean, beautiful yards. I provide high-quality, dignified, affordable housing to the incredibly hardworking families who actually form the backbone of this community. I know my tenants by their first names, just like Uncle Thomas did. When I drive through these quiet neighborhoods and see children safely playing in the front yards that my company maintains, I feel a profound, immense sense of purpose. I am honoring my uncle's incredible legacy every single day of my life. My life down here is so beautifully, fundamentally different from the frantic, hollow existence my biological family desperately chased back in Massachusetts. I do not belong to any exclusive elite country clubs. I do not attend formal, pretentious dinner parties where people wear expensive designer clothes they cannot actually afford to impress strangers they secretly hate. Instead, my weekends are spent hosting simple, relaxed backyard barbecues with genuine, honest people. My new community is completely filled with the kind of people my parents would have absolutely turned their noses up at. My best friend is Sarah, the incredibly smart, hardworking single mother who manages my main leasing office. The man who runs my primary contracting crew, David, brings his family over for dinner every single Sunday. We sit on the back patio eating grilled chicken on paper plates, drinking inexpensive beer, and laughing until our sides physically hurt. There is absolutely no calculating judgment in their eyes. Nobody is secretly evaluating my net worth or judging the brand of my shoes. They do not care about my bank account or my social status. They simply care about me as a human being. We support each other. We check on each other during the heavy tropical storms. We celebrate each other's small daily victories. I have completely surrounded myself with a beautiful, vibrant community that I consciously and deliberately chose. As I stand here watching the last golden rays of the sun fade into a deep purple twilight, I find myself reflecting deeply on the sheer psychological weight of my past. It is a very strange and painful thing to realize that you were never actually treated as a human being by the people who brought you into the world. For over 2 decades, I was what psychologists often call the glass child. When you are the glass child, your family looks directly at you, but they never actually see you. You are completely transparent. They look right through your accomplishments, right through your practical, reliable nature, and right through your silent suffering. They only ever focus their gaze on the beautiful, shiny golden child standing directly behind you. To my parents, Savannah was the glowing, magnificent center of their entire universe. She was the absolute physical manifestation of the wealthy, successful image they desperately wanted to project to the world. I was just the clear, invisible glass they occasionally used to protect her from the harsh outside elements. They only ever truly saw me when there was a smudge on the glass that they needed me to clean up. I was also the designated family scapegoat. I was the reliable, sturdy workhorse they could constantly burden with all of their incredibly heavy, unglamorous responsibilities. In their twisted, toxic minds, my absolute independence and my quiet financial stability were not things to be celebrated or praised. My stability was simply a convenient free resource for them to aggressively exploit. When Trent's fraudulent financial shell game began to violently collapse, they did not look at him with disgust. They looked at me with aggressive expectation. They genuinely believed that because I did not live a loud, extravagant life, my personal safety and my hard-earned security were completely disposable. It takes an incredibly long time to physically and emotionally untangle yourself from that kind of deep, generational dysfunction. When you spend your entire childhood and your early adult years being repeatedly, explicitly told that your only real value is what you can silently provide for others, you start to actually believe it. You internalize the toxic lie that if you just work a little harder, if you are just a little bit more accommodating, if you just solve one more massive crisis for them, they will finally validate you. You believe that if you completely set yourself on fire to keep them warm, they will eventually finally love you. But I learned the absolute hardest, most painful way possible that this is a complete and utter lie. You can never, ever buy genuine love from people who view relationships as simple financial transactions. You cannot earn respect from people who are fundamentally incapable of respecting anyone but themselves. My parents and my sister did not hate me because I was a bad person. They resented me because I possessed the one single thing they could never buy on credit. I had genuine, authentic independence. I had built a solid real life based on actual hard work, rather than hollow, empty appearances. My absolute refusal to participate in their shared delusion threatened to expose their entire fake world, and for that they completely despised me. But the most liberating, beautiful truth I have discovered in my new life on this coast is that true family is absolutely never, ever determined by biology or bloodlines. Blood simply dictates who you share genetic material with. It is nothing more than a biological accident of birth. True, authentic family is determined entirely by who voluntarily, willingly climbs down into the dark, muddy trenches with you when the terrible storms of life hit. My biological parents did not get into the trenches with Uncle Thomas. When the global pandemic destroyed his business and aggressive cancer attacked his body, they slammed their heavy mahogany door in his face. They called him a liability because his painful, messy reality threatened their pristine, fake country club image. They left him alone to drown in fear and medical debt. I got into the trenches. I drained every single penny of my own life savings. I took on massive, terrifying financial risk. I sat in those sterile, quiet hospital rooms, holding his frail hand while he took his final breaths. We became true family in those quiet, desperate moments. He saw me not as a glass child or a convenient scapegoat, but as a strong, capable woman. He trusted me with his entire life's legacy, and he empowered me to finally take complete control of my own destiny. The beautiful, thriving, multi-million-dollar real estate empire I manage today is the direct physical result of two people who chose to mutually love and protect each other when the rest of the world completely walked away. The incredible peace I feel right now, standing on this balcony, is worth more than all the money in my corporate accounts. I do not feel a single ounce of guilt for walking out of that law office and leaving my biological family to face the devastating, brutal consequences of their own actions. I don't lose sleep over the fact that they had to sell their massive, beautiful home to pay for Trent's criminal defense attorneys. I do not feel bad that Savannah is completely bankrupt and living in a cramped, dark apartment. They built their own magnificent trap using greed, entitlement, and pure arrogance. I simply refuse to be the absolute fool who paid their bail. Breaking a deeply ingrained toxic family cycle requires a tremendous, terrifying amount of strength. It requires you to look the people who raised you directly in the eyes and completely reject the horrible, false narrative they have written for you. It requires you to embrace the fact that they will absolutely cast you as the evil, selfish villain in their story, just to avoid facing their own terrible reflections in the mirror. You have to be entirely willing to be the villain in their fake story so that you can finally be the hero in your own authentic, beautiful life. I look out at the dark ocean, listening to the steady, eternal sound of the waves. My cell phone is resting on the small patio table next to my coffee mug. It is completely quiet. My parents' numbers have been permanently blocked for months. I do not check their social media. I do not ask old friends for updates on Trent's federal fraud trial. I have successfully drawn a massive, permanent hard line in the sand, and I have actively, fiercely protected the beautiful peace I built on the other side of it. I am no longer the invisible daughter. I am no longer the convenient, unpaid accountant. I am a successful, independent woman who owns her own time, her own business, and her own soul. I have completely broken the curse, and I am finally truly home. If you have ever been the invisible workhorse in your family, or if you've ever had to draw a hard line in the sand to protect what you've built, I want you to know that you are not alone. Setting boundaries is not a betrayal. It is survival. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done if you were sitting across that conference table. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I'll see you in the next story.